there is a really very frightening echo of the betrayal of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the idea that one can deal over their heads of a suffering nation. And I fear that this is very much what Trump wants to do. As far as he's concerned, might is right. And he is going to impose something. He doesn't want to involve really even his European allies.
Donald Trump is talking to Vladimir Putin about an end to the war in Ukraine. Is this peace in our time, with all that phrase brings with it, the appeasement of an aggressor who will undoubtedly be back for more? Or is it the welcome end to a war that has killed tens of thousands and appears to be mired in stalemate? A quick resolution to an awful conflict with some necessary concessions of territory, no matter how unpalatable that might be to the government of Ukraine. Your answer to that probably depends where you sit, comfortably in the US or uncomfortably in Ukraine. But it will bring home to European leaders meeting in Munich today that they are now dealing with a US president who wants to move fast and does not consider himself bound by any of the precedents set by his predecessors. What should their response be? Some appeasement of their own, appeasement of Trump? Or will this be the kick up the backside they need to take their own defence seriously? More on Ukraine shortly and European defence. We'll also look at whether politicians should get too involved with the work of regulators, talk to someone who knows firsthand what it's like to work with Donald Trump, and look at whether your next cup of coffee might come out of a test tube rather than from a bush. Maybe, or perhaps we will look back on this week as a pivotal moment in world history where the great powers began the process to bring war in Europe to an end. Presidents Trump and Putin have agreed to start negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, which sounds like a good thing. But it's also the end of the West's united front against Russia, a promise that the peace deal would have to be on Ukraine's terms, not those of the invader. European leaders can hardly be surprised by what Trump has done. Fred Fleitz, he advised Trump on Ukraine, was on this programme a couple of weeks ago. This is what he said then about a likely deal.
But Trump's going to have to assure Putin that he's going to get a deal that's fair. And again, in a perfect world, it's not a deal I would give the Russians, but we don't live in that world. I think among the things that will be offered is taking NATO membership for Ukraine off the table for a certain number of years, and perhaps offering some type of incentive, such as lowering sanctions, depending on how cooperative Russia is with the agreement.
Well, that was Fred Fleitz. Antony Beevor is one of our best-known historians, the authority on Russian military history. He wrote Stalingrad, of course. More recently, Russian Revolution and Civil War, 1917 to 21. Anthony, thanks for joining us. There's still a lot, of course, as always with Trump, that's uncertain here. But do you begin to see the outlines of what the final deal will be?
No, obviously one cannot, but it's pretty terrifying what we're seeing at the moment. We should always distrust historical parallels, especially those from the Second World War, which have always been so misused. But I mean, there is a really very frightening echo of the betrayal of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the idea that one can deal over their heads of a suffering nation. And I fear that this is very much what Trump wants to do. As far as he's concerned, might is right. And he is going to impose something. He doesn't want to involve really even his European allies. And I think this is a very, very important moment when we see whether NATO will actually survive in its existing form.
So let's just pick up on two of those points. We don't like historical parallels, but you think there is an echo here of appeasement?
There is definitely, yes.
And the future of NATO itself at threat?
I think it is under threat because basically what Trump is trying to say is this is a European mess. It's up to Europe to sort it out. And I'm afraid, to a certain degree, there is a ghastly element of truth in all of that, that Europe, by its complacency, ever since the idea of the peace dividend back at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, has simply not spent money. It has not invested, as all governments should do, in terms of their primary duty of defending a state over the years. And as a result, our armed forces have been completely hollowed out. And the idea of even sending peace enforcement troops to a potential future border of Ukraine and Russia, is pretty alarming. If they send, it's been suggested, 20,000 troops, they haven't even got the ammunition for a week's worth of fighting.
You said appeasement, which is obviously an awful historical parallel. I suppose Trump might reply, listen, this is really just real politics. There is no way I'm going to have a bigger involvement. I was elected on this premise of getting the US out of these kinds of wars. I am going to make a deal.
Well, there's realpolitik, yes. Of course, there is an element of that. But also, I'm afraid there is a question just simply of the idea that might is right. I mean, Trump, I'm afraid, seems to have rather greater sympathy for other dictators than for supposedly fellow democracies.
Was there ever a world in which you think the Ukrainian version of the peace might have come true? Has Zelensky played his hand well here?
Well, Zelensky, I think, hasn't really had much of a choice. I think he played his hand badly during the war. His obsession with territory right from the start, which came from a moral outrage at the cruelty of the Russian invasion and the destruction. But as a result, when he was sent the vehicles, the tanks and so forth, which were needed, they were badly used, there's no doubt about it. But it was also the fault of the West, and especially, I think, of the Biden administration, being so worried by the nuclear saber rattling of Putin that they didn't provide the right assistance with enough flexibility at the time.
Just go into a little bit more about Zelensky's tactics. You mean that he wasn't prepared to fall back and absorb with land rather than people and armaments the Russian advance?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the thing is that, all right, Ukraine is far smaller than Russia itself, but it is still quite a landmass, and they could have pulled back, encourage the Russians out of their defensive positions. I'm talking about in 2023, and then counterattacked, and that would have been the best way of actually using the weaponry that he had, the tanks and the armored vehicles which have been sent. But I'm afraid it's a bit late for that, and the chances of actually using the missiles, the enhanced artillery, and so forth, was not really available to him at that particular time.
Do you think Ukraine has any choice in this? Is this going to be negotiated over its head, over the Ukrainian government's head, or does it have another way forward?
Well, this is going to be very much up to, really, the European leaders of whether they can give sufficient guarantees of military support to Ukraine in the event of Zelensky refusing to accept what is forced upon him. So we're going to have to see how these things work out. Now, we may get surprises. I mean, Trump might possibly try to put a bit of pressure on Putin or whatever if he feels that his reputation around the world is going to suffer. But as things stand at the moment, it rather looks like a diktat which is being imposed.
Is there any sign really of the Europeans, getting some collective spine? We have a German election coming up very shortly, and so far, really, there's been a lot of talk about European defence consolidation, European defence spending, but it hasn't happened.
No, you're absolutely right, it hasn't. And I mean, what I find terrifying is that even after the red lights started flashing, we still haven't even replaced the ammunition which has been given to Ukraine. So, I mean, this is why the British Army, even if it was deployed along those borders or future potential borders, will not be in a very strong position.
What do you think Vladimir Putin will want from these negotiations with Trump? Is it just a matter of him keeping what he has in Ukraine or perhaps making some minor concessions, or might there be other things on the table as well?
Well, what's far more frightening is what's not on the table. I mean, the essential point is that Trump is only interested about getting a deal over land. His idea, the art of the deal, swap this, swap that, whatever it might be. But Putin's real thing is sovereignty. He wants to destroy Ukraine as a viable nation state, and that he is absolutely determined to do. So even if he comes to a deal, he will make sure that he can carry on sabotaging Ukraine afterwards, making sure that it is in a state of total penury, because it's pretty certain he's going to persuade Trump that he should be allowed to hang on to all of the money which has been frozen or confiscated since the start of the invasion. And as a result, Ukraine will be, should we say, in a position where it is so weak. And this is what Trump wants. What Putin wants.
It would be an even greater victory if, as you suggested earlier, he was able to make a big hole in NATO as it currently exists, at the same time.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the trouble. By Trump saying and Hesketh saying that basically this is going to be the responsibility for Europe, you're going to have to sort it out, but we're not going to give you any support. And refusing any question of a NATO membership for Ukraine to guarantee that final agreement, if it is an agreement at all, means that really that is basically putting a major split into NATO.
Do you think Trump just might be encouraged to, Putin might be encouraged to do even more? That if he thinks that Trump is the kind of person who can be quickly brought to the table and bought off, then he might become more aggressive?
He could well be, and this is certainly the fear of the Baltic states, and of course both on the northern border, but also in the south as well. The chances of further opportunism in the future are very, very great indeed. And the trouble is that all of the signals that the West has been putting out, certainly in Europe, is one of complete weakness. Ever since, as I say, going all the way back to the peace dividend, the idea that we just don't believe in war anymore, or that we don't believe in the threat of war anymore. And as a result, we're not prepared for it. And it's true, we are not. And one sees with a younger generation, and I mean, the Times' recent study and so forth, the young are in many cases swinging towards the idea that democracy has had it, and they think that a dictatorship is probably more effective. I'm not suggesting a majority of it, a very significant minority, and also that they're not prepared to fight for their own country.
You wrote sort of the wider consequences. You wrote a piece a while ago talking about the great man theory of history and how maybe it was a bit exaggerated. Maybe this is a reinforcement, a return to the great man theory of history. Trump and Putin negotiating over the heads of some not very tiny, but some small states in Europe.
It is, and this is actually, you're quite right. It's going back in a way to the idea of the big three at Yalta. Well, actually, let's face it, it was just the big two of Roosevelt and Stalin, believing that they had the right to dictate the fate of small nations, shifting the whole of Poland, from one side to another. The way that the idea you can actually redraw maps simply from a position of superpower. And I fear that we are very much back into that area.
Just finally, Anthony, this is really looking into the future, but if this is the end of NATO as we knew it, what replaces it?
I don't think it's necessarily the end of NATO entirely, because obviously I think that Europe, if it's got any sense, is going to have to come back together again very much more strongly and spend and invest far more in defence. But whether Trump recognizes the really dangerous path that he's taking, I mean, if he's not going to be prepared to help Europe, why should Europe help him if he starts having a conflict with China? So, I mean, there is going to have to be a certain sort of realization. But this is the problem of the disruptor who doesn't actually think things through.
Thank you very much, Antony Beevor, the military historian there.